Okay, so let's start with the session number 4, called Promoting Energy Transition in South and Southeast Asia. And we have wonderful moderator, my colleague from ADB, Pradeep Tarakan. Sorry, did I pronounce correctly? Hopefully. Regional Advisor, Energy Transition and Financing of South Asia Department based in ADB. Pradeep, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dina, and good morning, everybody. I see that we have about 35 participants online, and I'm sure those numbers are going to go up as the day progresses. As Dina said, my name is Pradeep Tarakan. I'm with the Asian Development Bank and very pleased to be your chair/moderator for this session this morning. I'm calling in from Delhi. It's about 6 a.m. and as I look out of the window, I see a very dull haze. As you know, India is grappling with massive urban pollution, high levels of PM 2.5 and PM 10. And through the haze, all I can see are construction cranes. So this is a constant reminder of how developing economies are grappling with the challenges of increasing their economic growth while also managing environmental pollution, environmental impacts, and increasing access to sustainable sources of energy. So really happy to present 3 very accomplished experts today to talk about promoting energy transition in South and Southeast Asia. Just a few house rules before we start off. So each presenter will speak for about 15 minutes, followed by a discussant who will respond for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up for Q&A for about 10 minutes. So as Dina mentioned, participants, attendees, please pose your questions in the chat box and I'll do my best to track them and then to raise them. And if we don't get to all of your questions, don't worry, please continue to pose them in the chat box and we'll make sure the organizers collect them and then we will get to your responses in time. Without further delay, let me move on to the first presentation. This is a really topical one. Are carbon taxes good for South Asia? That's the question. As you all know, carbon pricing is a very important tool for supporting any country's energy transition goals. So much so that a growing number of countries across the world are moving to put in place some form of carbon tax or carbon or emissions trading system. My information suggests there are about 68 jurisdictions across the world that have this in place. I'm sure our speaker will correct me if I'm wrong. With that, let me introduce the first speaker for the day. Valerie Ann Mercer-Blackman is a lead economist with the Equity, Finance and Investment Prospects Group at the World Bank. Prior to this, she was at the Asian Development Bank and also has worked at the Inter-American Development Bank and at the International Monetary Fund. So a lot of experience with MDBs and IFIs across the world. In the interest of time, I won't read the entire bios of all the speakers. As I said, they're all highly accomplished and those bios are available for all of you to look at in detail. So without further delay, let me invite Valerie to take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Pradeep. Thanks very much, and great introduction. Sorry to hear that the view from outside your window is not as great, but it's very much part of the discussion. So I will now share my screen. So this is joint work with 2 colleagues, Lazar Milivojevic, who has done some work actually on the climate change development reports for Bangladesh, and Victor Malonas, who's actually been involved in putting together the model that we use for this paper, which I will discuss in a minute. And so so the motivation and findings of the paper, this is really, unlike a lot of the other presentations that have been in the conference so far, this is really this is a macro effect, is looking at from a helicopter sort of hovering over the forest. So it's very much that sort of place of climate mitigation policies, specifically carbon taxation and energy subsidy removal. As far as we know, this is the first paper to look at all of the countries in South Asia. Unlike other regions, and this is, the spoiler alert, South Asia benefits disproportionately from the green transition in terms of growth, revenue mobilization, etc. And in terms of foregone costs, well, this is not even discussed in the paper, but just the fact that they are very large energy importers and have been affected by volatile international energy markets even in the last 2 years, this is even that another incentive to accelerate the energy transition. And we focus on energy. Non-renewable energy is about 2/3 of South Asia's greenhouse gas emissions, so obvious reason to focus on that. On the right-hand side, you can see a table of GDP per capita against energy intensity per capita, energy use per capita. Not surprising, South Asian countries are very much on the low end, very little use of energy, and even for their level of development, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and others. But this already gives you a sense of why it is, which is that they are also very low energy carbon consumers, or so that explains why putting a tax on carbon already is not going to have a big impact on them compared to other countries. What we do in this paper is, I don't have to preach the converted that carbon taxes is the first best tool to move things away from fossil fuel use and correct the externalities. Significant work on high income countries has, excuse me, there we go. I just have a, there we go. Significant work on high-income countries has already been done, and some middle-income countries, such as Latin America, some folks at the IMF, World Bank have, like Parry and others, have included India in some of this work, but they haven't, very little on low and middle-income countries. So this, here we apply the latest vintage of this IMF World Bank Climate Policy Assessment tool, which should be coming out very soon. It's a really nice model. It's got a lot of options for policymakers and everything to evaluate the impacts of carbon taxes on the 8 South Asian countries. So to your question, Pradeep, as to who has started to implement these carbon pricing and ETS implementation, the ones that are in blue, which are not that many. Some countries, Chile, Argentina, Colombia, South Africa, have started to implement carbon taxes of less than $10 per ton of CO2. So a little bit of progress there. Lots of ETSs, as you can see, even across provinces and of course in China. But encircled, you see South Asia. There's some considerations in Pakistan, but otherwise very little going on. And then one of the things that we looked at, of course, which I'm not going to spend very much time on, is what are South Asian countries pledging under the nationally determined contributions for the Paris Agreement. And you can see the NDC description, all sorts of other things. What we did is, in this paper, is we created sort of an effective carbon price of what it would mean for them to actually reach these goals. And on the right-hand side, on the third column, you can sort of see what it comes out. So for Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, it would be an effective price of around $30–40 per ton of CO2. But most of these are assuming that they get financing from advanced economies. And then you have India, Maldives, and Pakistan that basically have very unambitious targets because they actually would not need to have really a CO2, a carbon price in order to reach them. But again, it's not because everything is great, but because we find that they're somewhat unambitious in terms of mitigation. So this chart sort of wants to show you what is it we're planning to do. And it's just for each of the different fossil fuels, we can see what would be sort of what is a retail price, which is in red, the marker, against what is sort of the optimal price, externality inclusive price. So what is that? That's something that has the explicit and implicit subsidies taken out. So you can think of the supply cost, which is a blue bar. If the red dot is less than the blue dot, that basically means that there's some sort of explicit subsidy, government subsidies perhaps. And then the other part of those bars sort of show why you would have to have prices at those levels, and what are the sort of components of that price that would sort of take care of that externality. And sort of this is a nice illustration of what's sort of underlying what we're trying to do with that. So in most cases, obviously the red markers are way below the actual price, except a few small exceptions, Maldives and Nepal for LPG, but and not great so far. This is a representation of the CPAT just to show you that I'm not going to go through it, but just to show you that it really does have households, it has a power sector, it has industries and what they consume and where they go. Also, not only household consumption, but also household distribution. So we're going to be looking at revenues, GDP effects, and energy consumption, which is sort of the yellow parts in this model. So the model setup is the following. It's very simple. We implement a carbon tax starting at the end of 2023, which will be gradually increasing in equal increments every year to reach $25 per ton by 2030. And then we look at how things look in 2030. So the new price, carbon price, is being compared to a situation of business as usual. That is a scenario with no carbon tax. And of course, the price of an energy product is going to be whatever the price is at that time, plus the carbon tax. So the energy transition obviously dependent on the current mix of supply, use of different fuels in each country, and responsiveness to pricing. So these are the 5 areas along which we're going to sort of look at the results: welfare, government revenue, impacts on growth, and distributional impacts across industries and across households. So the first result is the substantial monetized welfare benefits of reduced fossil use. It's about equivalent to 0.8% of GDP for South Asia as a whole, but you see that we've actually done the calculation for each of the countries. And those benefits, which are in the dark marker, can be sort of comprised by various things. One is what we call the climate benefits, which is essentially the global warming benefits that country does by reducing the greenhouse gas emissions by X amount. This is a contribution that they are making to reduce global warming. Of course, that will also benefit other countries, but that is their share of it, shall we say. And then you have air pollution co-benefits, which of course local air pollution mortality and morbidity. Going to what you were saying, Pradeep, one study that was done shows that in 2018 alone, South Asia region, loss of per capita human capital because of premature deaths was 1.4% of GDP as a result of pollution, which is actually 5 times more than any other country. And we just did a recent study that it's really bad in urban areas. So don't have to tell you all that, but we did actually a cost benefit analysis of this. And then transport core benefits, averted road accidents, reduced road damage and congestion, which actually reduce productivity because people can't get to work, and then there's health costs associated with. So, and of course, in the blue part, you have the economic deadweight loss, which is the fact that they have to transition to higher prices, which is going to have a negative impact on welfare. So this is the first sort of result of the monetized benefits. The second one is the government revenue. So they have the carbon taxes. Every country will have a certain amount of government revenue. On average, it's 1.23% of GDP. On the right-hand side, you can see how this sort of grows over time, and it basically shows you that although the tax itself is growing by the same rate, because people are switching to renewable energy, the revenue is not growing as quickly every year. And if you look at it by sources, you can see that, of course, most of that revenue is going to come from coal, because it's one of the biggest, it's one of the fuels that pollutes the most, that produces most carbon. Then what we did is, okay, how could they spend the money? So we looked at 2 cases. One could be a targeted cash transfer to households in the bottom 70% of the consumption distribution. Now, we didn't do the poorest because we really you want uptake by everyone. You want to include the middle class, right? So that was one option. And the other option is public investment in the form of infrastructure access provision, or some of the types of sectors that help, consistent with SDGs, electricity, water, sanitation, and part of the sort of adaptation mechanisms they're going to need for more resilient infrastructure. And then we said, okay, well, let's look at sort of a combination of the two. So what if the government spends half on the cash transfers and a half on the infrastructure access? Of course, in practice, it's going to depend on the situation of every country. And the results, and here we're looking at the half and half. This is a growth effect. On the left-hand side, you can see the white dots show you that there is a small positive growth effect for South Asia, but it's pretty small, right? It's 0.4, 0.5% of GDP. Of course, the carbon tax itself is bad for growth, but the transfers and the infrastructure are good. And on the right-hand side, you can see Afghanistan and Nepal, the countries that really benefit the most, in large part because they just benefit so much from more infrastructure, given their level of development. Then we also looked at the distributional impact. I'm sorry, the distribution across industries. What that would be? Well, they're obviously going to have higher costs. So there's two sectors, cement and iron and steel, that have the highest cost, between 4 and 5% increase in costs by 2030 compared to BAU, business as usual. However, fortunately, these are very small sectors relative to the most of South Asia. The large sectors, which are food and services, are not as affected as much. And also, I don't have this here, but in the paper, we show there's huge differences across countries. So India, because it's a coal producer, has higher cost increases, and for example, and has some manufacturing. And for example, Bhutan and Maldives, and that basically have no cost increase. It's very small. But the effective cost increase for the region is 0.8% of GDP. So not very much. Then finally, the distribution across households. So here you can see the relative change in consumption-based Gini coefficient. So this is relative to business as usual, right? So in the pre-recycling, before the government does anything with the money, that you have a very small effect on distribution, slightly progressive, but really nothing. And then we look at the two or three different ways that they could redistribute the money, and you can find that in the 50-50, there's not much difference, but India and Pakistan have an important progressivity impact, shall we say? And 2-3% reduction in the Gini coefficient is not trivial. If you think of a country that over a decade has 5% reduction in Gini, that's very good. So these are not trivial numbers. And then I'm going to go through this very quickly in the sake of time, but we actually did the distribution across the deciles of households, and you can see that, for example, let's take the case of Pakistan, the direct effect, which is the actual carbon tax and everything, and the indirect effect, which is the fact that they pay more for goods that use fossil fuels to be produced, is negative. But of course, all of this is overwhelmed by the cash transfer and the infrastructure, which is which is in yellow, and infrastructure effect is in gray. But then we thought, okay, carbon tax is great, but let's face it, these countries have huge fuel subsidies already. It doesn't make a lot of sense to think about a carbon tax without first removing fuel subsidies, because otherwise you're sort of overlaying a new distortion over another distortion. So we sort of model a comprehensive energy price reform, which is essentially telling the countries, first you gradually get rid of your fuel subsidy, and then you introduce the positive, the non-zero carbon tax. And you can see on the left-hand side that the total, including fuel subsidy plus carbon tax, gives you monetized benefits of 0.94, out of which about 0.27 is just a subsidy phase out. So most of it comes from the climate effects, right? On the right-hand side, though, you can see that for South Asia, actually, both of them give you about the same amount of revenues, right? It's about half and half. So altogether 2.3, out of which about half and half is, depending on the country. In the case of Bhutan, the LPG subsidies are coming from India, so that's why they're shaded, but obviously it depends on that. Nepal actually doesn't have fuel subsidies, so most of it's coming from the carbon tax. And then we looked at the distribution again, which is the 50-50 Gini coefficients, and you can see that, again, at least for India and Pakistan, the fuel subsidy effect, the distributional, so getting rid of the fuel subsidy is almost as progressive, if not more, than introducing the carbon tax. So altogether, the Gini coefficient effect is even better. Very quickly, we did some sensitivity analysis. If you introduce only $5 per ton CO2 carbon tax, you will start seeing that over time, the effects are just not nearly as good. They wane very quickly. So, message is the higher a tax that you can introduce, the better. And also, if the initial price of fossil fuels is low when you introduce a carbon tax, you get much bigger bang for the buck. You get a much bigger welfare effects. Basically, the reason being that the economy is growing very quickly. People are using a lot of energy, so they're transitioning also very quickly. They're still transitioning at the same rate, but they're also going much faster. Okay, so why isn't everybody doing this? If this is such a great thing. So we do have a section on political economy considerations, and we're saying this is not an easy job. Policy needs to be comprehensive, well-sold program. A country has to have already a medium-term expenditure framework. There have to be initial conditions about the transparency of how much subsidies you have and who has it and where the arrears are. cash transfer and infrastructure fund need to be front loaded. So if you're going to give people money, it's got to be at the beginning, and the countries have to make it very clear the link between what they're doing and the fact that they're getting rid of these subsidies or introducing carbon taxes. And there has to be compensation, better for employment than for firms. If the firms will be switching anyway because they will be moving to new technologies, but they may leave their workers behind. That's it. Just wanted to conclude here that if you introduce a comprehensive energy price reform, we find that the $25 per ton CO2 plus subsidy phase out in South Asia is highly effective on environmental, fiscal, welfare, and distributional grounds. So political economy considerations need to be addressed carefully and are key to a successful energy transition process. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Valerie. That was a fascinating presentation. You went through a lot of material relatively quickly. I would encourage all of the participants to really sort of read the paper and dig into the details. There's a fascinating amount of analysis here. Let me invite Jules Hugo, economist with the Economic Research and Regional Cooperation Department of the ADB, who's our discussant for this particular presentation, to come in with his thoughts.
Thank you very much, Pradeep. Can you hear me?
Yes. Very clear.
Okay. Okay. Yes. Thank you very much, Valerie, for the paper. Just a bit of a disclosure here. No, I'm a trade economist, so that's really not my field. So apologies in advance if the comments are not relevant or you know, too basic perhaps, or completely you know, outside the point. All right, so the research question is you know, it seems to be a literature that's growing, having a macro look at the impact of the, you know, some form of policy towards the green transition, as opposed to the more traditional micro approach of, you know, looking at the impact of this tax on this specific outcome. So that's very useful to get a sense of the cost and benefits of the green transition. The method is using this climate policy assessment tool from the World Bank and the IMF, and the results is essentially that losses, because it's a tax, so it has efficiency losses, are more than offset by climate change gains, or at least the portion of climate change that is a portion to each country, and also by co-benefits, and that's ISO lower congestions, lower road injuries, better air quality, etc. All right. Okay. First question is trivial. So okay. So we all hear about Pakistan being asked by the IMF to phase out their fuel subsidies. That seems to be the point of the right-hand side chart. But if you look on the left-hand side, you have the price versus. So I understand that supply cost is, you know, the production cost, or the cost to get the product to the consumer, to supply to the consumer. And for none of these fuels on the left-hand side, I see that the market, the retail price is below the supply cost. So which is what I understood would be the definition of a fuel subsidy, right? You're selling by less than it costs to put it to the consumer. So I would have expected these you know, red diamonds or circles to be within the area of supply costs for Pakistan, for at least for some of them on the left hand side. Okay, so you know, okay, so one conclusion is that the effect is relatively small. I mean, it's positive, the effect of setting a carbon tax, but it's relatively small. So I'm, you know, wondering. So and more generally, I mean, I'm wondering from you know, what's the model is telling us. What is the share of each channel that explains the outcome of the model, right? The results of the model. So, for example, okay, we see there is this higher. There's this positive impact that is largely arising from the multiplier, from public investments that is used. So that's how the carbon taxation money is used. So there's a multiplier there. But what about the multiplier if there was no tax? If people kept the money essentially and would spend. So how those two multipliers compare to each other? And it seems to be that there's an assumption that the public spending multiplier is higher. But then why and by how much? Another reason I understand why there's a positive impact, or could be, I mean, I'm not sure, is that you're using in your scenario, using part of the revenue that is raised to redistribute to the poorest 70% households, who presumably have a higher propensity to consume than the entire population, because they're poorer, so they consume a larger share of their income. Is that also a channel that boosts growth and sort of offsets the efficiency loss? Okay, let's move to the third point, which is that, I mean, there's also this discussion that the green transition is costly and is going to be a net loss, essentially because it requires retiring, and the energy, ADB's energy transition mechanism is a case in point for that, which is that we have all this infrastructure that is polluting, that is emitting CO2, that is working just fine technically, and we're going to have to retire it earlier. Typically coal power plants, but also cars, all these investments in polluting industries that they're not going to be able to, these factories, these infrastructure, they're not going to be able to live their life. We're going to retire them early, so that's a loss, and we need to collectively pay for that, and it's the cost of the green transition. So is that in your so does that affect negatively the impact in the model, and if so, by how much? Another question that the paper raised for me is, okay, so looking at what the EU is doing, so on two fronts. So the EU, but also many other countries are doing energy trading system. So not carbon tax, but trading systems. Your argument and what's the literature seems to be saying is that the first best is a carbon tax. So why are they not doing it? What is more complicated in implementing a carbon tax than implementing an emission trading system? And the other question also related to essentially what the EU is doing is we have this carbon border adjustment mechanism coming up. It keeps being delayed, but coming up at some point. Do you think, or can the model say something about the incentive for South Asia to come up with its own carbon taxation, so they won't have to pay the EU adjustment mechanism because they will have already their own, and that's potentially a source of gain. So if you assume you have the CBAM in the EU, conditional on having the CBAM, what is the gain, and what are the gains and the losses of having the domestic carbon taxation? And the last point, so let me move to the very last one. So that happens to be a topic that I'm looking at because as Pradeep, I live in a city that's heavily polluted and that has very poor air quality in winter, and so the impact of PM 2.5, which is the core of the matter, above, so it's essentially concave. So the response function. So if you have PM 2.5 concentration on the x-axis and impact on health on or economic impact on the vertical axis, your curve is going to be essentially flat after a certain concentration. which is also South Asia and many, if not many. So the locations where population concentrates in South Asia. So right below the Himalaya and in Bangladesh. So those are concentrations which have very high. Those are locations which have very high concentration of PM 2.5, and they're presumably in this part of the response function where it's already almost flat. I'm wondering if the model takes into account this curvature of the response function, which impact is essentially that if you're reducing from a very high level, if your carbon tax is reducing PM 2.5 emission from a very high level to a level that is a bit less high but still very high, then you have zero impact on health. So is the model assuming this shape, or is it assuming a linear relationship which could boost your positive impact of artificially boost your positive impact of the carbon taxation? All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Oh, can I have Valerie? Were you going to respond to these, or?
Yes, yeah. Let me know when. Shall I go ahead?
Go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks very much. Really good comments. Great comments. So on the Pakistan thing, yeah. Sorry, I should have just clarified that. So the diagrams that we show with all the different, with the price versus the bars. Maybe you have it there. The one on the left-hand side is per unit of the primary energy. So the coal, the ones that are there, road diesel, those particular ones, their use. On the right-hand side, you're already seeing electricity. So for example, Pakistan, what happens there is that most of Pakistan's subsidies are on electricity. So you won't see it if you just look at the subsidy that's on whatever they use, natural gas or coal or something. You won't necessarily see it, and it's already aggregated. So you're going to have some of the cross effects of, whether it's subsidized at the producer level, at the consumer level, which you wouldn't necessarily catch there. So that's that, but that's a very good point that we have to clarify. Then the other question about the multiplier of public investment, and this is actually something that there's always a question of how big the multipliers are. And I should say, not just for this, but for everything, we've tried to be as conservative as possible. And that diagram that we showed you was the growth effects relative to business as usual. So you basically run a model in which you have no carbon price, and then you run the same model with a $25 carbon price. And then you look at what would be how different GDP would look at 2030. So in that sense, it's not, there's no, there's no difference on the multiplier elasticity, shall we say. Of course, lots of things are going to be different in that, right? There's going to be different prices, different relative prices, and things like that. But there's no that would be the way that would be affected. And then you had the question on the marginal propensity to consume. Actually, the way that it works is, and what I mentioned at the beginning is simple. It's very simple. Poor people in South Asia just don't consume a lot of carbon. So, for example, you have cases in which, for example, in Bangladesh, a lot of the rural areas use biomass and some other types of production, whereas people in the cities are driving cars and the more wealthy people. So it's just the energy composition, and there's also the indirect energy composition as well, which would be presumably if you use less machinery and things like that in your consumption. So it's not there may be some effect through the fact that they just consume marginal propensity to consume, but this is a Gini on consumption already. It's not an income. Which we're already taking into account doing the calculation over the consumption. On the retiring of capital earlier, excellent question. And I don't think anyone ever has a good question on this one. It's all the whole standard assets. What the model does try to do is this whole power switching level, which actually, as we speak right now, the engineers at the World Bank are arguing with the economists at the World Bank, because you may have a situation, and I think it was a nice discussion yesterday on this, about fuel switching, right? And how quickly can you switch the generation, the local, the place, all that sort of thing. But this is gradual enough in our case, because you're not asking any firm to retire. You're not asking any coal plant to retire. You're just changing their prices. So you're changing their incentives on this one here. So should it make a difference? Of course. The other thing is we don't know how other prices are changing as well. I mean, in a world in which this is actually happening, and depending what's happening with oil prices and things like that, there could be different effects. But yeah, we would have to do something much more specific on the country to get to this question. On the CBAM, yeah, this is not really a CBAM because this is more of a domestic. Of course, if you have a CBAM as well, then you would also be taking care of imported oil as well, which is important. We've actually done some other analysis showing that the European CBAM has very little effect on South Asia, just because of the types of the things that they import export to Europe are not very carbon intensive. But yeah, this would be another part of it too. And the calibration for air pollution, that's actually a really good question. I think that the answer is I would agree with you. I mean, again, one of the sort of indirect conclusions that we say, which of course all the scientists in the United Nations are saying, is that the earlier you act, the better, and the faster you come in. If you come up with a higher tax, everything is just going to be that much easier. It's just going to have an effect of the net present value effect that's much higher. So yes, and I don't know whether those effects are seen. I do know there's a lot of modeling that's gone on into that. So I don't know the answer to that question. So I will definitely get back to it. It's a very good question whether they've taken into account. So I don't know whether I've missed anything there, but thanks very much. Oh, and sorry, you did have on cutting fuel subsidies without triggering social unrest. Yeah, that's that's always a question, and that's why we think that things are always done. And in South Asia, they always do this, like they did in the last 2 years when they're going through a balance of payments problem and they don't have any money, and then they cut subsidies. And that's probably the worst time to do it, right? Because everybody needs the energy. So that's why we talk about the importance of doing something that's well planned and et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you so much, Valerie, and thank you, Jules. I think just to Jules's question earlier about why some countries or some jurisdictions choose ETS over taxes, I think there's a lot of learning to be had from the acid rain SOx and NOx emissions trading scheme in the US, which showed that emissions trading worked for the low-hanging fruit. It's easier to put in place. Of course, you need a monitoring system, you need a market, you need a regulator and all of that, but it's easier to do. But when you want deep emissions reductions, especially with carbon, when there are no replacements that are easily available, then taxes often are a better way to go. There are a couple of questions in the chat room, but Valerie, using the privilege of the chair, I want to go ahead and ask a question. And I don't need an answer, it's more of a comment. I was wondering if the modeling effort takes into account the fact that because of the tax, you're going to have a faster shift to clean technologies rather than business as usual. I mean, for instance, you're going to have a shift to green hydrogen, you're going to have a shift to more energy efficient technologies and so on. So is that taken into consideration in the modeling, the faster shift to clean energy technologies?
Yeah, in fact, that's exactly the way it works, right?
That's
so you're
exactly
basically changing the relative price of renewable versus non-renewable and creating the incentive for innovation into that. What you're not doing, which is, I think the beauty of these carbon taxes is that you're not telling them how they're going to do that. It's just, and of course, the slower they do that, there may be some firms that resist changing, and they can do that. They just have to pay they just have to pay a high tax. So that's the, but yeah, there's an assumption that this will set in motion, so to speak, a whole movement towards cleaner technologies.
And you've got pricing in there for energy storage as well, including green hydrogen and pipelines.
I don't know, to be honest, I'll have to check. I don't know how much the hydrogen storage stories in there. But I would have to check. I know that a lot of the stuff in South Asia, at least, maybe in other countries, has been mostly assuming wind and solar and things like that. But I'll have to check on that. It's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, that's really the important thing, right? Because when we talk to countries in the region, it's when replacing baseload power, that's when the real problems start. I mean, intermittent renewable energy is always good to have, but then storage is really the crux of it. There is a question here from Dina. It's posted in the chat room. If you want to respond to that, Valerie. I can read it out. So she's essentially saying, thank you for the presentation. And there is no, I think currently there is no carbon tax in South Asia. Are there such plans or prospects in South Asia, and can we incentivize it?
No, as far as we know, there are no plans. There's a special coal tax in India, but there's no plan. And you know, one of the things that we sort of want to push this paper out for is that it's sort of a little bit still a bit of a dirty word, you know, carbon taxing, like as in the United States, so it's not just India, or in some places. And I think a lot of it is because, you know, you do have to show the effects, and I think this is a contribution, is to try to show some of those effects. So.
Yeah, no, I think you just brought up a really important point. I mean, India has a royalty system on coal mining, and then it also has a district mineral fuels foundation system where the revenue from coal usage is actually provided to the districts for development work. And this has been going on since 2015, I think. And the last 7 years, evaluations have shown that a lot of those funds haven't dispersed. And even if they have dispersed, they don't spend it on skills development and retraining. So there is an issue of taxation is one thing, but what do you do with the revenue, right? And do you really spend it on the things you need to spend it on? That's the other aspect of political economy. I see somebody's hands up. Dina, go ahead. We should move on and also.
Thank you very much. Valeria, thank you for your answer and response to all Jules' comments. I find his comments also very nice. My question is, why carbon tax? Because in developing countries, mostly popular emission trading scheme, right? So if we compare, most countries done emission trading scheme like Kazakhstan, China. So why did you choose carbon tax? And some papers even comparing emission trading scheme versus carbon tax, because most countries actually really like, maybe they're likely to implement ETS rather than carbon tax. Like very few countries did carbon tax in developing Asia. Only Singapore, I think.
Yeah, and of course, China and Kazakhstan also are big producers of energy, so that may be easier for them. I think what Pradeep mentioned before, but carbon tax is easier to implement because you don't have to have regulators and monitoring and all this. It's you don't have to know anything about that. You just have to, I don't know, make sure people are collecting that paying their taxes. So that makes, and there are a lot of countries that started introducing it relatively successfully now with low ones. I mentioned them in the map, and it's beginning to heat up a bit more, precisely because it is easier to implement in most developing countries.
Thank you, Valerie. Thank you, Dina, and thank you, Jules. I think it's time to move on to the next presenter. So we've talked about macroeconomic impacts of a carbon tax. I think now it's time to move on to the firm level. And really, when we talk about transitioning to a low carbon energy system, you're talking about large investments, a large amount of capital expenditure. And these investments have to be at the $1 trillion scale. I mean, there are estimates that suggest for India alone, it's going to take between $10 to $14 trillion to achieve net zero emission goals by 2070. Gives me great pleasure to invite Ivan Diaz-Reni to talk about ASEAN energy utilities and ask the question, do they really have enough capital to transition to renewable energy? So Ivan is a professor at he's a professor of finance at Griffith University, and his research expertise includes climate finance, carbon markets, energy finance, and environmental policy. So Ivan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, and yeah, it's a pleasure to be here today. So yes, as you mentioned, the title is, do Asian energy utilities have enough capital to transition to renewable energy? I should point out this was really a master's thesis of Josh Morrison at the University of Otago, which he finished about 2 years. So this project has been a victim of COVID, unfortunately. So I think he did some interesting work. We wanted to take it a lot further, but this is the first time actually we get to present it. So we're very much open to ideas. I think, to be honest, we have an interesting idea, but I think there's probably a lot more we can do. So definitely open to suggestions. The other thing is, I've recently co-edited a special issue of Green Finance in Asia, Challenges and Policies and Avenues for Research. So I encourage the participants to look at that. And actually one of the things that we said in the editorial was to encourage more research from Asian-based researchers and more on a broader set of countries, which I'm pleased to see from the agenda. Anyhow, so our focus in this paper is on Asia, ASEAN, and I just put this chart just to highlight that, you know, it's a heterogeneous challenge. So energy transition is very different for different countries. I've recently moved to Australia from New Zealand, and you know, New Zealand we have 80%, 85% renewables, and so if we look at the challenge, it is very different by country. So you take Indonesia, it's 84% fossil fuels, but 45% of that is coal, versus, let's say, Singapore, which has very high share of fossil fuels, but very little coal. So you know, whether we believe natural gas is a transition fuel or not, then you know the challenge is very different by country. And of course, if we're going to meet this challenge, it's going to require an awful lot of investments. And so I was looking around, and you know, what estimates are there of the investment needed? And I'm very cautious about these numbers. And one of the reasons we started this project was to actually try to come up with bottom-up numbers as opposed to top-down numbers that look at these investment question. But for instance, Irina came up with, you know, to meet ASEAN 23% target by 2025, 290 billion, so circa 32 billion per annum. And then I took the much cited IPCC number of 2.4 trillion, and I simply multiplied it by the share of ASEAN GDP and came up with a number of roughly 168 billion per annum, about, you know, four or so trillion by 2050. So we're talking about a lot of money. And as I mentioned last time, different countries face a very different challenge in terms of decarbonizing their energy systems. But one of the things I want to bring out here is that it's not just a heterogeneous country challenge, it's a heterogeneous company challenge. Different companies have different energy utilities, have different energy mixes. And so the higher coal, the higher fossil fuels, especially as investors seek to price climate risk, will imply a higher cost of capital and ultimately higher financing costs, which, you know, might create a bit of a vicious circle, right? If they have very high fossil fuels, they may have higher cost of capital, which in turn makes it harder for them to transition. And so, you know, we ask the question, you know, do they have enough capital to transition? And you know, this is really, we use capital structure theory. So those of you that have done a bit of finance will know Modigliani and Miller. And so, you know, the idea was to try and come up with an optimal level of debt and say, okay, if firms moved from the current level of debt to the optimal level of debt, you know, is there enough to transition, right? And unsurprisingly, the answer is no. And then the question is, how much more capital do they need beyond, you know, just increasing debt to its optimal level, right? And the answer is an awful lot, right? But also the answer is heterogeneous. Some companies are already there, 100% renewables. Others have a very big challenge. So, you know, what, why, how? So what is a predicted optimal capital structure of Asian energy utilities given an outlook of a low carbon energy transition? And do they have enough capital to do so? And if not, how much extra do they need to get, right? And again, I think one of the reasons we're doing this is to focus the debate not, you know, beyond country and look at the firms that actually need to implement this change. So I think this is really critical. If we're going to get transition, you know, are we going to get incumbents to do the transition, or are we just going to manage them down? There are all these related questions, right? Tying into sort of Schumpeterian ideas of, you know, is it new firms that create the revolution, or can incumbents adapt? So we use data from 2015 to 2019. And so we infer, and I put in quotation marks, optimal low carbon capital structure from a training sample of high renewable European firms, and then we deduct current debt, and that gives you the additional debt capacity. And then we calculate what their investment needs are to transition all their fossil fuels away from fossil fuels to renewables. We deduct that additional debt capacity and get the unmet capital needs. So that's a rough outline of our approach. And as I said, this draws on there's been just a ton of capital structure studies done, starting with Modigliani Mill in 1958, saying capital structure doesn't matter, and then they realize that the world is actually has frictions, and so the idea that we want to minimize the weighted average cost of capital to maximize firm value to get an optimal use of debt. So the idea that we want to get to an optimal level. That said, in the real world, we can see it in the oil majors. Oil majors famously hold an excess amount of equity, and they have that largely for financial flexibility. Another thing to bear in mind is there's research showing that as we've liberalized energy systems or former utilities, it's increased earnings volatility, which has decreased the ability for firms to borrow. So there's perhaps this tension between the greening agenda and the competition agenda. So methods, again, I won't go into too much detail, but largely listed energy utilities. We used a heap of data. And so what we did is we trained based on a high European renewable sample. There were 29 which had more than 75% of their generating portfolio in renewables. And we had a model of market leverage and book leverage. I'll ignore book leverage. We just carry on looking at market leverage, which is essentially debt to equity ratio, right? And so we use the coefficients from the European sample, and we're saying Europe is the future. Okay, I'm saying that as a Brit, but also as a European, and Europe is ahead in energy transition. They've been at this for 20 odd years. And again, I'm open to ideas, what other ways we could try and get to this optimal capital structure within the paper. So we use the coefficients from Europe to predict a future optimal debt capacity. So that's PLEV for a sample of ASEAN energy utilities, of which there were 54, and represent roughly 53% of installed capacity in the Asian region. And I think this is also quite telling, right? Because it means that actually it's not that many firms that we need to work with to do this transition, or at least half of this transition. And actually it's even fewer firms, as you'll see. There's a number of these are already 100% renewables. So we deduct predicted leverage minus market leverage to get initial debt capacity. And then we try to figure out what the investment needs are. And so we made an assumption that it's an 80% solar, 90% wind that fossil fuels are being replaced with at these costs. And we need to make obviously assumptions about capacity factors. I think there's a lot more sensitivities we could do here. And so we have, the idea that there's this optimal or future debt capacity. We deduct current debt that gives us extra capital, extra debt that they could raise. Is that enough to meet the full transition of their portfolio to renewables? And if not, then how much more do they need to raise? Okay, and of course, if they're going to raise more, it cannot be just debt, right? Because if we then calculate how much extra debt and equity they need to raise beyond their optimal capital structure to meet the investment needs. And so here are our results. So here are the two samples. So they differed in profitability. So the Asian energy utilities were more profitable. They had lower renewables. They were in higher GDP countries and lower tax areas. Generally, they tended to have lower debts than our sample, but that wasn't significant. So this is just a comparison of means. This is where we did our fractional regression. Just checking on my time here. Our fractional regression, that we got the coefficients to fit our Asian sample to get the predicted optimal capital structure. And in line with the literature, higher growth firms generally had the higher debt capacity, tangibility. So this is fixed assets. So the more fixed assets, the more you can borrow. Again, with the literature, higher tax rates. So the higher tax yield, the higher use of debt. Again, in line with the literature. And so this gets us to the nitty gritty. So we get our PL, predicted leverage, PLEV, sorry, and our actual market leverage. And so we do it for the full Asian sample. And so predicted leverage is about 50%, and market leverage is about 42.7. So, you know, there's about 7% potential increase in leverage based on our very stylized exercise. And so, you know, then we sort of split that into a low, a high and high ASEAN renewable sample and a low one. And it turns out that the high renewable sample has a capacity to increase debt even more than those that have less debt. So that suggests that, you know, there may be a whole load of highly concentrated renewable firms in Asia that could increase the renewables, and the debt capacity is in theory there. So then that leaves us to figure out, well, what are the unmet investment needs? So as I mentioned, our sample covers around 50% of installed capacity. And so if we look at sort of our baseline and using our solar and wind costs, and so so these are, if we convert using the baseline costs, the fossil fuels into that 80 solar, 20% wind mix, then these firms would need to raise 441 billion to transition, of which 31 billion could be met from optimizing their capital structure. And so that still leaves over 411 billion left to raise, right? And since our sample covers 50% of installed capacity, this implies that about just under $1 trillion is the cost of transition. But again, if you use various different costs, the numbers look quite different, right? So the message is that, you know, going to an optimal capital structure is going to meet less than 10% of financing needs. And so firms need to raise, you know, a lot of equity and debt to get there. As I said, it's a relatively small number of firms we need to target. I said 54, it's actually less, as I mentioned, because of these 19 are essentially 100% renewable. So they have no additional financing needs, right? We're ignoring growth, right? Demand growth. So of those 35, 19 were below capital structure. And of these, only 6 could meet transition needs through additional debt. So they had very little debt, or they had they didn't have very far to go in terms of transition. 16 were above optimal, and so 29 had unmet investment or equity needs. So this gives us a sense of the distribution of the firms. So 29 firms needed to raise more equity, 35 needed to raise more debt, but of those 6 could do so within their optimal capital structure. And some of the, you know, how much did they need to raise relative to current equity and current debt? And, you know, some of the numbers, so the minimum is low, but for some firms, the numbers are huge, right? So for some firms, the challenge is massive. So again, there's big heterogeneity. So to conclude, energy firms are under leveraged relative to high renewable European energy sample. However, this is less than 10%. So if they go to this optimum, this is less than 10% of the needs for renewable transition. So, you know, it will only raise 31 billion, and we need to be raising about 441 billion, of which roughly half is equity, half is debt. Yeah, the needs highlights the need of how much capital needs to be raised across the sector. In terms of policy implications, so policymakers need to look at the issue of financing at firm level, so bottom up. And again, these bottom up estimates can also help us in terms of understanding how realistic these top-down estimates are. So, you know, you get these big numbers bandied about and people get very excited about them. And, you know, I don't know how much scrutiny they get, and actually going bottom up might be a good way to go. Nearly all utilities need to raise additional debt, and most need to raise more equity, or a good number need to raise more equity. Some utilities look unviable depending on the speed of transition. So for those that need to raise, those that need to raise very large proportions, so you know, 7,000% more debt or 2,000 more equity, it just looks unviable. And so this raises some interesting questions, right? So you know, their cost of capital, assuming no government intervention, if they are in a pure market environment, is likely to get higher, and it creates this endogenous or this sort of negative a circular process where I mentioned before, that they need to transition. Increasingly, they're under increasing transition pressure, but you know, the cost of capital goes up. One option here is, and I think it was talked about yesterday, is the sort of I also teach on the banking side, the bad bank option, which is you take all fossil fuel assets, you put them into a separate entity with some sort of government support and government management, and then demerge the renewables and let that be listed and finance itself. So a little bit like the E.ON demerger of all its fossil fuel assets into Juniper. You're already seeing that in Europe, right? So that's already happened in Europe with the two biggest German utilities. There are also really, as I intimated when I looked at the literature, interesting competition considerations here. So do we back incumbents to transition, or do we manage them down? So a bit like the bad bank option, or do we have a mixture of both? Okay, so we have more competition, more players in the sector, but then more competition in turn may affect debt capacity because they have more volatile returns. So they're tough questions here. And I think there's a role for financial innovation, in particular transition bonds. So they've been talked about more. So perhaps with some government or multinational development bank support, that these firms are helped to finance these transitions through bonds. And actually, there's a real from the sustainable finance perspective, one of the big questions that investors have is impact, right? And so if you buy a green bond, and most green bonds are really rolling over projects that are already existing, they free up new capital for project developers, but it's harder to have that impact. Whereas in a transition bond, that impact is a lot more direct. So again, financial innovation may have an important role to play here.
Ivan, let me perhaps just bring in our discussant. Thank you so much, Ivan, for your presentation. And I'd like to invite Lazar Milivojevic. He is a macroeconomist at the World Bank's South Asia region, Chief Economist's Office. Lazar, can you hear me? Could you come in, please?
Thank you, Pradeep. Yes, could you hear me?
Yes, very clearly. Go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you for your invitation to discuss this pretty interesting paper. The same disclaimer as in Jules' case holds. I'm a macroeconomist, as you said, and this is not my area of expertise, so I apologize in advance if my comments are basic. To go straight to the results of the paper, Ivan and his co-authors show that ASEAN energy firms are under-leveraged relative to highly renewable European energy sector firms. The results show that estimated costs of renewable transition considerably surpass the available debt capacity, implying that the energy sector firms will have to raise not only their debt, but also a significant amount of equity. In aggregate, in both cases, they would need to increase it by more than 3 times. And if we talk in terms of American dollars, it's more than 200 billion. In both cases of new equity and new debt. I'm providing just a couple of numbers from the recent World Bank reports just to show you why this is important and how huge is the mismatch between the supply and demand side of climate financing. Investments needed to build climate resilience and accelerate the green transition are by far beyond the reach of for emerging markets in developing economies. And climate financing is estimated to reach at least $1.5 trillion American dollars annually until 2030. This is also the case in the Asian economies. Their needs are also immense, given the region's vulnerability to climate hazards and rising energy demand in all the countries. Here you can see that the total amount of outstanding sustainable debt in the ASEAN 5 countries is about 24 billion of US dollars. Just to remind you what the authors estimated here, so more than 10 times lower than it's needed only in the energy sector firms right now. While the amount of private equity financing for clean and climate technologies is estimated to be about just 265 million. So you can see that sustainable debt markets are picking up slowly in the past 5 years, still not that significant. And in comparison to the overall amount of outstanding debt, the sustainable debt is basically negligible. Again, to come up with the numbers, in ASEAN 5 countries, sustainable debt is just a small fraction of conventional markets, so just 2.5%, while the case for more developed economies, top 20 countries, is between 5 and 60%. Similarly, for the equity, the percentage is 0.57, while if we look in just developed markets in East Asia and the Pacific, the share is around 7.9%. So there is much necessary to be done from the policy side to provide more climate financing, and a comprehensive strategy will be crucial to achieve the green transition. Just briefly, it is expected that what is necessary is more concessional financing, also combining public and private capital through innovative financial instruments, appropriate climate policies that would align climate objectives with right incentives in the markets, and in the end, also international support that must complement countries' individual efforts. So something that our multilateral development banks could help with. To go back to the methodology in the paper, as you could hear, Ivan, the authors use fractional regressions, which is appropriate, given that the dependent variable, financial average, takes values between 0 and 1, and they regress it to different firms' characteristics based on a training sample of highly renewable European energy sector firms. The authors, after estimating the model, use its coefficients to find the predicted values of leverage ratios and compare it with the actual ones, just to determine the debt capacity that can be used to fund renewable energy projects. Besides that part, it is also necessary to calculate the replacement costs. And the authors do that by multiplying the solar and wind capacity necessary to replace fossil fuels by the cost per megawatt to install this capacity. To be able to make such calculation, they rely on numerous assumptions. Renewable energy mix targets is one of them, but also capacity factors of current new power plants, and also the costs of installing renewable energy infrastructure. I would say that, as Ivan also pointed out, the paper provides a nice illustration of the investment needs and the optimal capital structure of the energy sector firms in the region. And we could say that the results are helpful in a sense that they provide an order of magnitude. But I would just say that the quantity results should be taken with a grain of salt. So my main concern about the results is their external validity of the analysis, and whether we can apply the findings of the analysis to a broader context. Here I have in mind 3 perspectives. First of all, the cross-section component. What I mean by that is whether the current structure of European financial market and energy sector firms in Europe resembles what we have in ASEAN economies, or what we are expected to have in the upcoming period. Then the time component, and by that I mean what was the case with the financial markets. Let's say, for instance, in the previous years, think of a low equilibrium environment, and what would the effect of that on the optimal capital structure, and could we just translate that in the future period, and what ASEAN firms are expected to have, also with time component, we could think about all those assumptions the author make in different aspects and whether we could really expect these numbers and these assumptions to hold in the future. And in the very end, this is just a broad perspective, but again, pretty important, I would say, when it comes to these analyses. Basically, the main question is the long-term validity of the estimated relationships within a reduced form model, again, based on a couple of years in the previous decade, and whether those estimated relationships will hold, especially if we expect tremendous structural shifts, as it's probably going to be the case with the whole green transition. This is all from my side. Ivan, thank you for the presentation, and yeah, I really enjoyed reading the paper, and yeah, I'm curious.
Thank you, Lazar.
Your views.
Ivan, if you want to provide a brief set of responses to the issues that have been raised, thank you.
Thank you very much, Lazar. I agree with you. I said at the beginning, and you probably didn't read it in the paper. And by the way, sorry, the paper still feels like a thesis, so there's far too much in it. So I hope you skipped the bits, and we're hopefully going to polish it. I completely agree with your cross-sectional thing, and I've really struggled with this. One of the issues I thought about there was just to train on a high renewable Asian sample, but it turns out that they have lower debt. So it could be that, Asia is pricing this quite negatively, that they're all renewable. Yeah, I'm open to ideas, but that's a hard problem. And I agree, look, you have in the paper the companies that are involved. I certainly wouldn't make that public. I would have a general description, because it is useful in terms of order of magnitude, and all helpful in terms of knowing that these firms face very different challenges in terms of this financing. And again, with the time component, yes. And again, I think that would have been dealt with if we could train on, let's say, for instance, an Asian sample that was well, actually, that probably wouldn't work. That would work on the cross-sectional one. Yeah, I guess some other controls we could try and throw in there, but in terms of the long-term validity, I think our coefficients in terms of the capital structure theory, that they're pretty reliable, right? So generally, we know that tangibility matters. So in that one, I'm less concerned. But with the first two, yeah, I'm open to ideas, but I'm not too sure what else we could do.
Thank you, Ivan. If I may, are there any questions in the chat window? Okay, so while we wait for oh, I see Dina's hands are up. Dina, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Pradeep. Yeah, I always got questions, so if no audience questions, I will use this opportunity. Yeah, Ivan, thank you very much. Excellent presentation, and Lazar, very good discussion. My question, Ivan, to you about ASEAN power plants. Actually, I'm impressed with data set you got on the power plants. This is very, even for my own country, I struggle to get data from power plants. So could you, how would you describe power plants? Usually they have low profit, they are state owned, because they are different from banks or financial sector, right? I think usually electricity rates very low in developing Asia. So I think they are always in big loss. They're probably not profitable. So what are your, since your paper is financial, what are financial characteristics of the ASEAN power plants?
I mean, I'll go back to, I don't know if you can see my slide, but when I compared the two samples, at least this is at firm level, I don't think they're necessarily not profitable. So compared to Europe, if we take these companies, and remember, these are all listed. So this was a sample of listed companies, and we actually used two data sets. So S&P Market Intelligence have a database of plants, and we also relied on WRI, World Resources Institute. They also have one, and we sort of reconciled those two. But if we look at the profitability of these firms, it's clear that the ASEAN sample is a lot more profitable, right, than the European. But we know, I mean, the Economist wrote this famous article, How to Lose a Trillion Euros, right? Because that's the European energy sector has been hit hard by the energy transition, right? So I don't necessarily buy that they're they're unprofitable, and I imagine given ASEAN growth, utilization rates are reasonably high, etc. So I haven't looked at the plant data in detail, but from that high level comparison of means in terms of profitability, these firms are more profitable.
So, Ivan, if I could just follow up on that, just to be clear, and I'm sorry I haven't gone into the paper in great detail. So you're not looking at state-owned energy companies at all? These are all listed private companies?
Well, so, I mean, some firms are partly state-owned, and a lot of these will still have state stakes. But at the you know, we could do this analysis for firms. You know, we use market leverage, so you know, we need in market prices, right? But you know, so quite a lot of firms have been privatized, and so there's still a state involvement.
Yeah,
and maybe that's, I think in some of, there were a lot of other regressions the student did. He was producing regressions quicker than I could give him feedback, frankly. I think we had an SOE control in there where there was still some state intervention. Yeah,
because that was going to be my question, saying, look, that there would be definitely, I would have thought that between SOE and fully private firms, it would be interesting to see how they go in for leverage and you know, any changes.
Yeah.
For instance, PLN, which is entirely state-owned. You've got TNB in Malaysia, which is, as you say, partially listed. Again, EVN in Viet Nam, which is state-owned. It'll be really interesting to see, you know, what are the differences. And the other thing is, I think, is also political economy and culture. You know, the 97 crisis hit the energy sector in Southeast Asia very heavily. A lot of firms were over-leveraged. So I wonder how much of what you're seeing of under leverage is also a kind of a hangover of that period, firms being much more cautious, either through the regulatory oversight or through their own sort of intrinsic risk-taking ability. A couple of other things, just energy storage. This again comes up. I mean, I asked this of Valerie as well. This is a very expensive proposition still, and we don't really have good estimates of what the cost curves are going to be like. We know wind and solar has come down. It's pretty cheap. And I see that you didn't include energy storage. And so that's going to become really important as we talk about whole-scale energy transition. So that's something to keep in mind, I think, as a cost factor.
Yeah, I mean, that would clearly add to the cost, right? And the amount of capital needed, for sure. Yeah, we didn't. So we do not account for network costs. We do not account for increases in demand, or on the flip side, declining. Well, we do look at sort of declining renewable costs, but yeah, increases in demand and network costs. Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Just looking around.
And in network costs, I also include you know, that the need for storage, right, for balanced systems.
Yeah. Just outside of the region, not necessarily Southeast Asia, but in South Asia, there is a particular energy firm that's been in the news a lot for its excessive binging on debt and sort of some of the challenges that come there. So that's the other end of the spectrum.
Absolutely. Look, and as I said, that negative cycle, if firms don't transition and they are market-based, then, you know, they are going to start to feel the pressure. The cost of equity is going to go up. And, you know, you may end up having expensive bailouts given that political economy experience that you were intimating about before, right? You know, you need reliability of supply. And I think the energy sector and banks are two typical sectors where the state will intervene to ensure that provision of service continues.
Thank you, man. Okay, last call. We have over 50 participants, so I would encourage folks to type questions into the chat window. This is all work in progress, I understand, Ivan, so I think all these comments from the listeners would help you. Oh, there you go. Valerie, please come in.
Yeah, actually, just in terms of the question of storability, which now, I mean, I'm just wondering, but I was doing something completely separate with Europeans who are already concerned about it because their energy, they're so way ahead on the energy transition that they're already thinking about 100% renewables. And of course, this is a big sort of constraint. So I'm just wondering how much you need. I mean, how much do you is this a worry if you want to get 100% renewables? Because obviously we're not nowhere close to that in South Asia and Southeast Asia. Or would that already be a concern? And I think you might be able to respond to this better, but this is an open question also to Ivan and others.
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, just speaking because I'm sitting in India right now and most of my days are consumed with India's, questions, it is already becoming an issue in India. India has a national storage mission, energy storage mission, and they see that battery energy storage is still expensive. So they're kind of relying in the near term on pump storage, which is also an expensive technology. And it takes time because you're talking about dams, civil works, resettlement, environmental issues. So even at about 25 to 30% renewable energy penetration, storage is becoming important. Because you don't necessarily have, in Europe, you have the very strong international interconnections, cross-border power trade, as a result of which, the Netherlands or let's say Denmark can go to 40% wind because it's able to import hydro from its neighboring countries and balance out. Whereas South Asia doesn't have those strong interconnections and Southeast Asia doesn't have them either. So actually at much lower levels of renewable energy penetration, storage is becoming an issue.
I think so. We also need to be careful about when we talk about storage, right? So what do we mean by storage? So is it short term?
Yeah.
I mean, are we talking intraday? Are we talking monthly, or we're looking across years? So I've recently come from New Zealand and we're at 85% renewables there. We have lakes, large hydro lakes, and they serve as reasonably good stores. They probably have 2 or 3 months of storage. So there's several ways you can do it. So we need to be clear what we mean by storage. So do we mean short term, long term, or for instance, in New Zealand, the big issue is dry years when lake levels are low. And the other issue is how do we solve it, right? So do we have pumped hydro? I guess that's sort of longer term, or interconnectors. And I suspect you're going to get a lot more interconnectors, right? And so there's really interesting modeling that was done in Europe from my days in my PhD 20 years ago, that the more interconnected you are, then the higher amount of renewables you can have. And I mean, China has built a huge HVDC network, and you're seeing the Asian power grid is being talked about. Europe is clearly integrating its electricity market. So I think if you're an island, and yes, 30% can cause some problems. In South Australia, we had a problem a couple of years ago, and actually Elon Musk solved it within 100 days with one of his short-term batteries, right? So, but that was short-term storage, yeah, and that was a balancing issue.
Yeah, what India is really talking about is round-the-clock renewables. They've actually had some recent bids out for round-the-clock. So it's really, when you're talking about a country that's reliant on coal for 60% of its power needs, and when we talk about replacing those baseload coal, it's really round-the-clock renewables. But I totally, I think I agree with you on the need for power interconnections. ADB has spent the last 2 decades trying to get countries in the greater Mekong sub-region to work together on power trade, and also in South Asia. But, it comes with its own challenges. Countries often see power interconnections as somehow constraining energy security. They prefer, to work bilaterally rather than multilaterally. And they often look at sort of dedicated power corridors or enclaves, or power plants in one country exports directly to the power grid in the other country, rather than having an open power market. So it's a process of decades. I mean, I think that is something we all are working on, but it takes a lot longer. And that's a good segue, talking about energy security, to move on to our next speakers. So thank you, Ivan and Lazar. And if I could bring in the next speaker to talk to us, Ibu Rika Safrina, who's an energy modeling and policy planning officer with the ASEAN Center for Energy. And she's going to be talking to us about balancing the needs of energy security, economic growth, and climate sustainability in the ASEAN. Ibu Rika, please go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Pradeep, for your kind introduction, and thank you to ADBI for this great opportunity for me to present my draft paper about balancing the needs of energy security, economic growth, and climate sustainability in ASEAN. First of all, let me introduce our institution. The ASEAN Center for Energy, or ACE, is an intergovernmental organization that works closely and directly with the government of Southeast Asia in this sector. ASEAN comprises of 10 member states, including Brunei Darussalam, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos PDR or Laos, Myanmar, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. ACE has 3 key roles. As a catalyst, ACE strengthens ASEAN energy cooperation by providing platforms for policy advisory, best practices, and capacity building. As a knowledge hub, ACE provides knowledge repository and services through data management, publication, and dissemination. And lastly, as a think tank, ACE identifies innovative solutions for ASEAN's energy challenges on policies, regulatory frameworks, and technologies. We are very open for energy project collaborations or any ASEAN countries. So ASEAN is one of the most dynamic regions in the world, contributing to significant emissions. Based on data from Climate Watch, the total greenhouse gas emissions in 2019 from 10 ASEAN member states accounted for just 4.6% of the global energy-related emissions. 3 member states produce emissions per capita more than the global average value, namely Brunei, Singapore, and Malaysia. 10 AMS, only Singapore and Brunei experience a declining trend of emitting emissions in the energy sector, with a peak in the year 1994 for Singapore and 2008 for Brunei. The rest of the bloc are developing countries with rapid economic growth. One of the important factors affecting economic growth is energy access. It is a critical driver for GDP increase and a precondition for improving income inequality. However, energy access remains an issue in several ASEAN countries. As of 2020, an estimated 95% of total ASEAN households had access to electricity and 70% used clean cooking methods. It means more efforts are needed by the region to accomplish the 100% energy access targets by 2030 as directed by SDG 7. To satisfy the ever-growing demand for fulfilling the region's energy access and boosting economic growth, ASEAN's total primary energy supply has grown rapidly, dominated by fossil fuels. The high dependency rate on fossil fuel imports would harm energy security in the future because their price is volatile, especially during shocks like pandemic, geopolitical wars, and financial crisis. So against this, there is a need to balance environmental sustainability, stressed by the international community with economic growth while ensuring energy security in ASEAN. This paper aims to empirically investigate the changing structure of the economy by comparing it with the changing role of energy in ASEAN. Given the important role of governments, a comprehensive review of national energy policies stated in official documents is also essential to investigate the IMF's capability to accelerate energy transition while securing energy supply. Therefore, the second objective of this research is to assess national policies in ASEAN related to energy transition away from coal, using horizontal integrated policy analysis. So structural transformation is one of the theoretical framework as a basis for this research. Structural transformation is defined as the changes in the structure of an economy from low productivity and labor-intensive activities into higher productivity, higher income, and skill-intensive activities. The typical pattern of structural transformation is the movement of economic activities from agriculture to industry and then from industry to service. The Kuznets curve, proposed by an economist named Simon Kuznets in the 1950s, hypothesized that income inequality first rises and then falls as the result of economic structure development proceeds from agriculture to industry to services. The same inverted U-shaped curve is also suggested for relationship between environmental degradation and income per capita, which is the environmental Kuznets curve. So structural transformation enables a country's economy to transition from low polluting primary sector, which is agriculture, to high polluting secondary sector, which is industry, and then back to lower polluting tertiary sector, which is service. But sometimes the trend has the trend differ from the usual pathway of structural transformation. Developing countries are relocating away from agriculture directly to services before their industry sector has even matured. Since the three economic structures, agriculture, industry, and services are all energy end users, the structural transformation has implications for the shifts in the final energy consumption. Not only facing a growing energy demand due to structural transformation, but ASEAN also needs to balance its energy trilemma. It involves in competing demands of energy security, energy equity, and environmental sustainability. Energy security is the nation's capacity to meet current and future energy demand reliably, withstand and bounce back swiftly from system shocks with minimal disruption to supplies. On the other hand, energy equity concerns the nation's ability to afford energy access for its people. Meanwhile, the third side of the complex energy trilemma represents the transition of a nation's energy system towards mitigating potential environmental harm and climate change impacts. Managing the three components are sometimes conflicting, especially regarding environmental sustainability. It was found that both energy security and energy equity have positive relationships with economic growth, while environmental sustainability has a negative one. Managing these three pillars is challenging and should be considered carefully in every policymaking process in the energy sector. So the primary data for this study is the historical and projections of the ASEAN energy landscape collected from the 7 ASEAN Energy Outlook, or AO7. AO7 outlines 4 future scenarios. Baseline, the first one is baseline or business as usual, which follows in historical trends without any policy interventions. The second one, AMS target scenario or ATS, which incorporates existing national policies from all 10 ASEAN member states. And then the third scenario, APAIC target scenario, APS, considers the more stronger ambitions and targets that was set in the regional APAIC blueprint. Last, the least cost optimization incorporates or takes into consideration the neutral technologies that are viable to be implemented in ASEAN. The analysis used historical data from 2005 to 2020 and projection data from 2021 to 2050. Cross-validation and critical review among sources have been conducted during the development of AO7 to ensure the validity of the data and prior to analysis. So in the first component, energy security, it is data on TFEC, TPES, and data surrounding power sector, including installed power capacity and power generation. Meanwhile, for energy equity, the study assesses electrification rate and clean cooking access. The GHG emissions data is used to analyze environmental sustainability factor. All the above elements of the energy trilemma are being compared with economic growth indicators. The macroeconomics consists of total and sectoral GDP, which were collected from the key indicators database of ADB. In addition, several other socio data were also gathered for all 10 ASEAN member states, such as the population, number of households, to calculate the cumulative electrification and clean cooking access rate as a region, as well as GDP and energy per capita, in emission per capita also. In terms of methodology, several steps of descriptive analysis were performed for all the data. In addition, an integrative policy review was conducted to get a glimpse of ASEAN policymakers' priorities among energy trilemma and to provide suitable policy recommendations. The paper shows that energy savings could reach 54% by 2050 by implementing more stringent energy efficiency and conservation policies. It displays in the graph, even though the GDP per capita will rise sharply, but the increasing energy consumption will remain rather slow. Contrary with the structural transformation theory, where economy transforms from industry to services, ASEAN energy consumption was historically dominated already by service sector, and the trend was predicted to change by 2050, where consumption in the industry will rise more significantly compared to service sector. It may suggest that national and regional policies in the industrial energy efficiency were still lacking than the policies in service sector, including transportation. In terms of oil, in terms of fuel, oil consumption will still be higher than electricity. ASEAN has been a net importer of oil since before 2005, dominated by the use in transportation sector. Although coal consumption is decreasing, coal is projected still play an essential role in the ASEAN electricity generation mix, even in its most ambitious scenario. Meanwhile, in the findings for economic growth and energy equity, it was found that Cambodia and the Philippines had the highest electricity prices among the ASEAN economies. Brunei, which has the lowest electricity cost in Southeast Asia, highly subsidizes its electricity prices. Imposing subsidy places the fiscal burden on the government, which benefits from the country's revenue from its large natural gas resource. While Brunei takes advantage of its gas resource, Vietnam and Indonesia develop their coal resources for electricity production. The domestic price of coal in these countries is kept below the global price, which encourages use in the power sector. Despite the reliability of fossil-based generation in supplying the growing energy gap, access to electricity remains an issue in several ASEAN countries. The barrier to the electrification of these areas includes the high investment requirements for electricity transmissions due to its remote location. Almost all IMS declare decarbonization target year, either carbon neutrality or net zero emissions. Major coal producers and consumers in ASEAN, such as Indonesia, the Philippines, and Vietnam, are among those to commit to shift to phase out coal. More than half of AMS have now committed to cutting global emissions of methane by at least 30% by 2030 from 2020 levels. Under the APIC Phase 2, the IMS agreed to set the regional targets of achieving 23% RE share in TPS and 35% in installed power capacity, as well as to reduce energy intensity by 32% from 2005 level, all by 2025. And all of this shows that the IMS commitment in environmental sustainability, although they are facing challenges in securing energy supply, especially in the rural and remote areas. After considering all the challenges mentioned before, these are several key takeaways and policy implications in line with the structural transformation of most ASEAN member states, which are moving its economy from agriculture towards industry. Energy efficiency measures in the industrial sector should be done firmly, such as through labeling and implementing MEPS. Still in the demand side, fuel switching in the transport sector should be escalated through the use of biofuel, electric vehicles, and mass public transport. For securing the supply side, the region should establish biomass co-firing and implement more efficient coal power plants, such as using high efficient, low emission, and carbon capture utilization storage technologies. And then the rural off-grid system is a viable complement to accelerate RE adoption. Renewable offers a cost-effective solution to rural application. It maximizes the local resource potential and ensures that remote areas achieve sustainable and reliable energy supply away from the central grid. When the resources are insufficient, supplying clean energy through interconnections and multilateral power trade within the region is very recommended, I think, as discussed in the previous session as well. Finally, a collaborative approach among cross-sectoral policymakers and support from international community, especially in financing climate change mitigation, should be adopted. I think that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Burika. Thanks very much. If I could invite the discussant, Naoki Sakai, to come in. So Naoki is CEO of Japan Nudge Promotion Council. He's formerly with the ADB, so he's a former colleague of mine, and he's also spent some time with the Tokyo Electric Power Company. Naoki, please go ahead.
Thank you, Pradeep, for having me at this session and giving opportunity to review this excellent paper. So let me start with the objective of this paper. As Rika mentioned, that this paper provides a review of the energy landscape and the policies in the ASEAN countries in balancing the needs of the three challenges: energy security, economic growth, and climate sustainability. And this paper aims to investigate the changing structure of the economy by comparing it with the changing role of the energy, especially coal, in the ASEAN. And the second aim is to assess the national policies in ASEAN related to energy transition away from coal using horizontal integrated policy analysis. And please let me share my overall observation. First, I really appreciate such an ambitious challenge to cover 3 fundamental issues, which I also had tackled as a former energy specialist in ADB from 2000 to 2016. And this paper properly identified the issues and raised the way forward based on the depth policy assessments. And this paper leads to the pragmatic conclusion to gradually fade out the coal by mainstreaming renewable energy. And this paper excellently analyzed the multiple policies based on the reliable information, as I summarized here, both at the vertically dimension at the regional and the countries level, as well as horizontally 3 dimensions, namely in the below, the macroeconomy and macroeconomic energy policies and concrete measures. And this paper shows the linkage of those vertical and horizontal initiatives, including mutual intervention of the such as transformation of the economy affect energy structure, and at the same time transformation of the energy sector affect the macroeconomy structure. And now I move to the conclusion of this paper. So Rika concluded 4 points. Number 1 is that heavy reliance on the fossil fuel-based power generation will be a critical challenge for energy security and sustainability. And the second is that tackling this issue by fuel shifting toward low carbon sources can together satisfy the 2 dimensions of the energy trilemma. And third, although the half of AMS already pledged to phase out coal, its existing will not vanish entirely in the near future. And with solid commitment of the ASEAN policymakers to implement measures both on the demand and the supply side, balancing the needs of this energy security, energy equity, and climate sustainability can be realized. Now, the light in the box is my wish list. So I hope that based on this very firm ground, maybe we can discuss more using the critical reasoning at this moment, which is how to make it, when, and by what means. And in fact, Rika, I believe that in the second, the ASEAN Energy Outlook, so this ASEAN Energy Outlook deeply analyzed the issues where I believe that you had contributed very in a considerable manner. So I would like to learn from that a little bit. And also, let me put more technical matters. So this paper concludes that there is a potential for additional solar and wind sources based on the renewable energy sources assessment, although they are still limited to 20% penetration. And this paper concluded that the power grid needs to be enhanced with flexibility and digitalization. And I fully agree with that. And on top of that, there exist multiple and complicated and interlinked factors hampering its dimension of the policy and regulatory framework, such as feed-in tariff, power sector reform, intra and inter-regional cooperation. And the second one is finance, the PPP, risk mitigation measures, concessional financings, demand charges, and so on. And technology, we should consider about technology breakthrough through the 20 years, which could be the decentralization of the power system, demand response, storage, VPP, V2G, and hydrogen. So policy should create enabling environment to solve these issues, taking a holistic approach. And the second one is about energy efficiency. So demand response, including the creation of the power exchange market to manage the intermittency nature of the VRC, like delta kilowatt or kilowatt as a capacity. And also installation on site renewable energy and storage, which you mentioned, which could be drastically alleviate the burden of the power grid. And possible carbon trading is also. So in addition, this paper could also cover the policy not only for the industrial energy efficiency, but also household energy efficiency. So finally, I interpreted the structure of this solution. On the left side, on the green circle, how to mainstream the renewable industry through the policy and the finance and the technology should be considered and examined. And based on that, the second consideration in the right, the blue circle, show the mutual intervention of the combating climate change, economic growth, and energy security. So finally, please let me share the case study of India about this national solar mission. And the government of India set out this national solar mission in 2010, so it's 13 years ago. And this national solar mission is a grand policy and regulatory framework with a strong commitment of the central government and together with each state initiatives, including Gujarat, Rajasthan, Maharashtra, Karnataka, West Bengal, so on. And the objective is to establish India as a global leader in solar energy by creating the policy conditions for its diffusion across the country as quickly as possible. And the original target was installation of 20 gigawatt by 2022, last year. But surprisingly, the target was surpassed in 2018, 4 years ahead, and the installation capacity in 2021 was around 50 gigawatts. So as a result, India, in some sense, achieved grid parity and the industry development, export of the solar park model, particularly to African countries, and also achieved energy access. So this is a good example, I believe, that the well-designed policy framework with a strong commitment of the central and the state governments make the dynamic change. So I hope this kind of cross-regional analysis can enhance the value of this excellent paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Naoki, and thanks for that case study as well. And that was particularly illustrative. Rika, I was wondering if you had any quick comments or feedback before we open it up for questions.
I just want to say thank you very much for the valuable insights that Mr. Naoki provided. It was really good comments. It was really helpful for improving my paper and even for my future research. I noted your suggestion to provide conclusions with more concrete and dynamic critical reasoning, and also the way forward for energy trilemma in ASEAN. Also, I noted your suggestions. I think you were quite good into diagrams, how to mainstream our industry and then into solving the trilemma, and then to explain more details in to aspect energy supply and energy demand. And like you mentioned, in energy demand and energy supply, that there is when we want to penetrate more variable renewable energy into the grid, there will be an intermittency issues and so on. I think that it needs to be considered into the whole broad perspective, and also in the energy demand. Yeah, and thank you also for sharing about the case study of India. I think it is very good example. Thank you.
Thank you, Rika. Are there any questions from the participants? Okay, while we wait for questions to come in, I just wanted to again raise another point about what about 4 or 5 years ago, there were reports from IRENA and IEA that sort of documented how renewable energy procurement prices in Southeast Asia were relatively high compared to, say, South Asia. I mean, Naoki talked about the solar park model and how prices came down quite a lot, particularly in India, but then also you saw that in other regions across the world. And one of the sort of pointers was that Southeast Asia traditionally has, had a very strong focus on local content and having domestic firms bid for projects within the country. And also the limited market for renewables. I mean, these are the main reasons that were cited for the cost of renewable energy procurement being high. Rika, just a question. I mean, what are you seeing across the region in terms of, is any of this changing? I know Myanmar and Cambodia have had some global bids out and tendering out for renewable and especially solar projects in the past. But many other countries like Malaysia and Indonesia continue to focus on domestic content and indigenous, majority ownership of firms, for instance. So any thoughts on sort of how that is impacting on the cost of renewables? Any changes that are expected in the near term?
I thank you for the question. I think the other country in ASEAN said also Vietnam, we can look how they grow the renewable energy share in the last few years, especially solar. I think it was helped by the good regulations and incentives in such as feed-in tariffs and so on. But there is a financial burden in several ASEAN countries dominated by because of the limited public financing. So, and also there is the high risk and low investment return that makes the banks reluctant to finance clean energy projects or renewable energy projects. I think the investment should be more prioritized in first in electricity transmission networks, because it can have a multiplier effect to meeting long-term energy security and sustainability in ASEAN. And innovations are also needed to scale up to increase the availability of financial sources, as well as budget allocation and strong collaboration with the private sector and international donors such as ADB. For example, like we noted that last year ADB has an MOU with the PLN and Cirebon power plant to early retirement of coal power plant. I think using senior debt, if I'm not mistaken. I think that kind of strategy can be leveraged to other IPPs in Indonesia and even in other countries in ASEAN. And then because of the pandemic, of course, the country is still in the recovery mode. Most of the fiscal budgets are more focused on health sector or other sectors, so there is a limited of capacity, financial capacity from the countries. So therefore, we need to think of other innovative solutions, such as implementing greening fiscal consolidation, such as carbon pricing, for example, like in the first paper talk about this. But then the revenue of that new additional revenue should be used in green conditions, like green investment. I think that can be used as financial sources also for other for ASEAN countries. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think just also it's important to note that Indonesia does have a pilot program for emissions trading between power plants in the country. And I'm not quite sure, have they actually put in place a carbon price of about $3 a ton that was being discussed last year? I don't know.
I think it's still ongoing.
The discussions are ongoing. I mean, and they are starting at a very low level. I think they pegged it to Singapore, which has it started at $5 a ton, right? So they said if Singapore is charging $5, then we want to be lower than that, given our lower GDP per capita. Thank you. Yeah. There is a question from the audience. Just wondering, in your conclusion, Vietnam and Indonesia are projected to still utilize coal as their energy source. However, they have recently received huge international support for transitioning from coal to clean energy through the Just Energy Transition Program, which is a G7-led program. How does your research address these changes?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. Yeah, we noted that in last year, we have the Just Energy Transition, two AMS, Indonesia and Vietnam, received a Just Energy Transition partnership with several developed countries. In the partnership to develop or several investment policy plan and also resource mobilization plan for these two countries to retirement for the retirement of coal power plant earlier. I think this support from the developed countries can help the two countries to phase out or phase down coal earlier than they targeted. For example, the Indonesia aims to have net zero emissions by 2060 or sooner with the support of international. So I think this kind of support can help them to achieve their earlier goal in phase down coal. Yeah, I think that's all.
Thank you. Okay, we've got a couple of more minutes. So if there are any pressing questions or burning topics, please feel free to bring it up. Also, oh, there you go. The polling results are out. I noticed that the panelists were prevented from participating in the poll.
Yeah, I cannot vote.
Okay, well, if there aren't any further questions, I'd like to bring this panel to a close. Thank you very much to the speakers for your research and for presenting your papers, and also to the discussants for taking the time to review them closely and provide them with constructive comments. And thank you to all of you, the participants, the 55 odd people that signed up to listen to this webinar. And as Dina mentioned earlier, the material will be available, and we look forward to your participation in future webinars as well. Thanks very much, and let me hand you back to Dina.
Thank you very much, speakers and Pradeep, for excellent moderation. Yeah, I really enjoyed the chat, all the links. Thank you so much. So I would like to, so let's finish this session and move to the keynote speech. The keynote speech will be provided by Dan Brian Millison, our another colleague also. He's from Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department at ADB, Manila. And his talk today on reinvention of extractive industries. So I think we didn't have any paper at this workshop on extractive industry, so this is the only one. Be nice to hear. Dan, you're here?
Yes, and thanks. And I didn't realize I was the keynote speaker. I just thought I was going to provide a few extra remarks, but I'm happy to have that label, if that's okay.
It's easy to label. You are keynote speaker. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, all right. Well, I do have some presentation notes. I should try to share from my screen?
Yes, please. And also, if you can use camera, that would be nice to see your face.
Well,
thank you. Excellent.
You know what I look like, but once I start the presentation, I'm gonna turn the camera off because
okay.
You don't really need to see me. So I hope, can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. And do you see the next slide now?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So yeah, this is mainly we're more about the mining side and the fuel production side relative to the energy transition. And this is a picture of one of the biggest mines in the world. This is in Indonesia. This is Freeport, Indonesia, copper, gold, and silver mine. It's been there since the 1970s, I think, when the initial exploration work was done. I visited there in 1995 when it was going through a major expansion, and their operating contract runs for another another 20 years. And so first point that I want to make is that there are different parts of the extractive industries, and the mining industry in general, metals mining, coal mining, oil and natural gas production, and geothermal energy as well. They all have one thing in common. The companies dig holes in the ground and they extract money from those holes in the ground. So if you want to do anything on the fuel side, which we have to do if we're going to get to net zero, and the mineral production side, which is also critical for the transition, then we have to adjust that fundamental business of digging holes in the ground and extracting money from those holes in the ground. And just to get an idea what does the energy transition look like, you can actually see it in parts of the United States. This is in western Kansas, where in the foreground we've got oil and gas wells, or oil is going into those big white tanks. And in the background, you can see wind turbines. And at that particular site, if you look around 360 degrees, there are wind turbines as far as the eye can see. And this is on private land. The landowner gets a royalty payment they get a share of the gross revenue of the oil and gas production. And they also get some kind of a rental payment for hosting the wind turbines. And we don't see any solar here, but if we zoom out and look at this part of the country, Kansas is there in the middle of the red polygon. If we just look at the resource in place of wind and solar, if we do a very modest density development, 25 megawatts per kilometer square of solar, 5 megawatts of wind per kilometer square, just inside that red polygon, that amount of electricity would be 30 times the total electricity consumption in the United States today. And most of the bioenergy, most of the biofuels, fuel ethanol, biodiesel that's produced in the United States today comes from inside that red polygon. And if we were to aggressively develop the renewable energy, just the solar and wind, we would have this enormous surplus. What would we do with it? Well, we can try to convert electrons to molecules, and we can make hydrogen, and we can put hydrogen into existing gas pipeline networks, which there are numerous pipelines underground in this area. We would also, even to use a modest amount of that solar and wind for electricity, we need to do some kind of major upgrade on the high voltage transmission network. But the point is, the renewable resource in place is enormous compared to demand. So the question is, how do we monetize that, and how do we use that renewable energy to facilitate a transition in the extractives industry? And the focus here, then, forget about the electricity sector for a minute, because if we close all the coal-fired power plants, if we zero out the emissions from the electricity production, we've only done 1/7 of our job. So it's not the power plants, as Toro Kubo says, I've heard him say more than once, it's not the power plants, it's the emissions, it's the fuel. So, we have electricity is the tip of the iceberg, and 6/7 of global energy production is using fossil fuel and some traditional biomass for non-electricity purposes. So heat, metal production, other construction materials production, chemical manufacturing, et cetera. Now, there are precedents for the legislation and regulatory action to phase out fossil fuels. And the one that I would highlight in the US is that we've actually been doing this for more than 50 years. We started phasing out coal-fired power in the United States in 1970, although that was not the intent of the legislation, but largely because of that legislation, coal-fired power plant construction in the US peaked in the late 1980s. We stopped building coal-fired power plants in the US 10 years ago, and since 2010, we've retired 1/3 of the fleet. And the rest of the coal-fired power plants are going to be gone in another 10, 15 years. And then there's going to be, beginning in 2030 to 2040, there's going to be a phase out of the gas-fired power plants. Toxic Substance Control Act, this was a US law. We stopped making polychlorinated biphenyls. And this is commonly used in electricity transformers. This legislation was copied around the world. And if you want to find PCBs anymore, good luck, because the only place you might find them is in waste oil from some really old transformers. Montreal Protocol is the world's only international environmental treaty which is really successful. What did that do? Stopped making a certain category of chemicals. And the more recent one that I think is really noteworthy, and I'll talk a little more about this, is IMO started implementing a series of regulations 3 years ago that requires ship owners and operators to ultimately reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from ocean-going vessels by 50% by 2030, and there's a further reduction by 2050 of 70% overall greenhouse gas emissions, 50% of which is supposed to be CO2 reductions. And we already see transformation in the fuel supply chain and in propulsion systems, new vessels being ordered which are designed to run on dual fuels, including green methanol and other stuff like that. I'll talk a little more about this. Now, again, the extractive industries, they make money by digging holes in the ground and extracting money out of the ground. So if you want a coal mining company to leave the coal in the ground, they've got to have an alternative where they can make more money. Otherwise, they have no incentive to stop mining coal. And when the price goes up, like it has in the last couple of years, and it's still well above long-term trends, coal miners are digging as much as they can out of the ground. But there are opportunities at the end of life, as well as during the lifetime of mines, and as well in the upstream oil and gas industry and the geothermal industry, we see possibilities for renewable fuel development, power to X, using renewable energy, converting electrons to molecules, offshore renewables. If we go beyond the economic limit of a transmission connection, we would do renewables by doing power to X. One of the interesting things happening in the geothermal business is lithium mining of geothermal brines. There's a big commercial exercise getting started in the Salton Sea of California. Energy storage and abandoned oil and gas wells. All of these things are going on at some stage of R&D or more commercial action. I think ADB might actually have a project going in India where there's going to be a abandoned mine pit used for pumped hydro. Now, the renewable energy business is a real estate business. You may not think about it that way, but if you don't have land to build solar plants and wind farms, if you don't have access to a site to drill a geothermal well, if you don't have land to grow bioenergy crops, you can't do anything. If you go offshore, there's a lot of room offshore in the exclusive economic zones. That's really a different story. But one of the key points here is that most surface mining sites, the active mining operation is a small part of the contract area. So there's actually room, in theory, to use land that's already been disturbed and to do something productive with that land that would create an additional revenue stream. Now, maybe not replace the money you're making, in this case, off the nickel mine, but add revenue that might be pretty interesting to consider, and just to get some ideas about what we might use if we're taking available land at a mining operation where it's been disturbed, but it's not the mine face. Then we could grow different types of biomass and make different types of products. And there's a pretty broad universe of things. So this is just a snapshot of some of the the biomass, the crops that might be grown, production pathways, and benchmark market prices. So now down at the bottom, the green ellipse there, if we think about trying to grow something for the coal mining, we could grow biomass and make biochar and bury that, and we could use that to offset the emissions in the fossil coal that's being mined. And so the mining company could sell low carbon coal, and that biochar, the CO2 reduction from that biochar could be certified, and we could have a certified low carbon coal. No one's tried to do that, but there's really nothing stopping them from doing it except their imagination. That would be a purely voluntary thing today. But the two markets that I want to highlight, in the International Maritime Organization, there is a compliance market. So if we can make renewable fuel today that fits the quality and characteristics of very low sulfur fuel oil, if we can make it at par with the fossil VLSFO, we can sell as much as we can make, because this is a compliance market. It's not voluntary. And that's a $220 billion a year market last year. That's equivalent to the GDP of Qatar. The sustainable aviation fuel market is a little bit different. Here, the International Civil Aviation Organization is facilitating a volunteer market-based program, a voluntary program, and they're trying to get the airline companies to buy fuel, basically buy renewable aviation fuel, sustainable aviation fuel. This is not a compliance market yet, but airline companies anticipate that this will be. So the key point here is that there may be price barriers in some market, but today there are aviation fuel consumers that are taking the price, right? But the limit, there's a limit. So the upper end of what buyers are generally taking is 3 times the cost of fossil Jet A. So, right, so if we were, last week, Jet A was trading at 65 cents per liter. So if we could make it for about $2 a liter, we can probably sell it. And so we've got Delta and United Airlines from the US that are committing to buy whatever is being produced at that 3x price. Now, this is a very small quantity of fuel relative to the total market. So last year, the aviation fuel market was a little over $180 billion, equivalent to the GDP of Kuwait. So that's the scale of the market we're talking about. But that high-priced sustainable aviation fuel is being blended across the 275 million liters per year, whatever. So the price increase is lost in the round-off, and consumers have absolutely zero sensitivity to that increased fuel price. And also, airlines, United and American, have committed to buying next generation supersonic planes, which don't even have a full-scale prototype flying yet. So we're seeing that the aviation fuel consumers are looking at the IMO market and looking at what International Civil Aviation Organization is pushing, and they're seeing a transition that's starting to happen already, even in the absence of any enabling legislation. Now, let's talk about the coal mining business for a second. This Semirara Island, this is off south of Manila area, about 350, 400 kilometers. This is the largest coal mine in the Philippines at 16 million tons a year at long-term price range, $50 to $100 a ton. This is $1 billion a year business. And this is a captive market. They send this coal mostly to power plants that the parent company owns that service Metro Manila. Now they have room to do some renewable energy stuff, but they're busy making money mining and selling coal. So if we could get their attention, what might we do? Well, that one pit in the right center part of the big image there, that's a mine pit that's been flooded. That's not being actively mined. There's room there to put about 25 megawatts of floating solar. The red polygon at the upper left, that's active mine pit. When that mining ceases, there'd be room there for about 200 megawatts of floating solar and maybe some innovative biomass. Just doing solar, we could produce well over the energy consumption, total energy consumption on this island. There's only 39,000 people living there. So probably 50 megawatts of solar would probably be enough for everything. What would we do with the surplus? Well, power to X, we could make some hydrogen with that amount of solar. You know, if we're getting $4 per kilogram, $4,000 per ton of hydrogen, they'd be able to make about $25 million a year. If that's not very much compared to the coal mining business, but at the end of life of the coal mining business, that's part of a soft landing for the mining company if they continue to have access to that site and want to try to make money off of it. We could also be doing some kind of biomass crops. And oh, by the way, this island is in one of the best spots for wind power in the Philippines that there is. It doesn't get much better than this. If just within the mining area, we could do about 150 megawatts of wind, assuming that power density 5 megawatts per kilometer squared, and they'd be able to make about $34 million a year if you covered the whole island with wind at that density. It'd go up to about 168. So conceivably, we could be looking at, say, maybe $200 million a year converting solar and wind to hydrogen, which is only about a fifth of what they're making in a normal year on the coal mining operation. So we're not going to get this mining company to stop mining coal, partly because the local demand for coal in the Philippines grid, until there's an enormous amount of renewables on the grid in Luzon, we're not going to be able to cut back much on the coal-fired output. Now, just to get a sense of where we are on this power to X, converting electrons to hydrogen, and then hydrogen to something else, looking at these different parameters on electricity prices, electrolyzer CapEx, and PPA prices in different parts of the world, and costs of production in different parts of the world. Our base cost of converting electrons to hydrogen today, we're coming in, it looks like we should be able to make hydrogen for about $3 per kilogram, $3.50 per kilogram. So if we had a buyer who would pay $4, we should be able to make a healthy profit. There's no price barrier if we have a buyer. Maybe there's a regulatory barrier somewhere, but I don't think there really is today. Let's look at another possibility. Again, end of life. This is in Indonesia and West Papua. In the same neighborhood as that Freeport mine, a little bit farther to the west, is Indonesia's third LNG project, which ADB helped finance in the early days, as well as the expansion in 2016. Now, the gas isn't going to last forever. At some point, the fields are going to decline, become unprofitable, or will otherwise be stranded. And there's solar resource there. There's room in the water to build at least 2,500 megawatts of solar. And if we converted that to hydrogen and got that $4 per kilogram price, in theory, our gross revenue, we'd be able to make $280 million a year. I don't know how much that is compared to the LNG. It doesn't matter. What I'm talking about is at the end of the life of the LNG project there, the infrastructure is there to support this offshore solar development and do a power to X business. And the theoretical gross revenue at that $4 per kilogram price is $280 million a year. Now, if BP, Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, Pertamina are shareholders in this, if they wanted to start doing this today, they could start doing this today, because the space out there in the water would not interfere with the oil and gas operations. The gas production is all offshore. There's a palm oil plantation over, that's a completely separate business. those folks could be trying to make sustainable aviation fuel. Don't know what's happening there. Another place in Indonesia, in South Kalimantan, from 2013 to 2017, coal production in South Kalimantan was about 150 million tons a year. If we took some of this area that's been disturbed by the coal mining, we could probably make about 500,000 tons a year of biocoal. That's pretty small potatoes, but one idea is that instead of trying to make biocoal and sell that instead of fossil coal, make biochar, put it in the ground, certify that CO2 removal, and that's actual CO2 removal, not a phantom credit from a fictional offset. Do biochar, put it in the ground, remove CO2 from the atmosphere, and claim that against the carbon content of the coal that's being sold. And then we haven't done anything to the power plants, but effectively we've reduced the emissions from the power plants because we have carbon that has CO2 reduction built into it. Now, there's another extractive industry, and you probably never thought about water as an extractive industry, but it is, because we're mining surface and groundwater globally. Almost every ADB client country is water stressed. And what I've talked about so far is really about evolution of extractive industries, about kind of what happens at the end of life of mines and oil and gas fields. We can see that we can create a landing pad so that there's a soft landing, and the businesses can do this on their own. They don't really need policy support to do this. If they can find buyers for products at a price where they can make money, there's no price barrier, as I mentioned a few times. But now here, this is something that we've talked about a little bit inside ADB, but the water sector has not, I don't think has really talked about this much. But what's going on here? Okay, so we have desalination plants all over the place, and we can close the loop on the reject brine side. And if there's a logical sequence of mineral precipitation. We take out edible salts, sodium chloride, calcium chloride in particular. We can sell those into the edible salt market, probably make at least $1,000 a ton, maybe $2,000 a ton. Sea salt retails in the US for $2,000 to $4,000 per ton. We get the salts out first to remove calcium and sodium, which are two of the highest concentrated cations. Then we can precipitate carbonates. So calcium carbonate, magnesium carbonate, and there we're locking up CO2 that's been in seawater. We convert it to rock, and we can use that as a construction material aggregate, or maybe we can make some non-structural building materials with that, and we use something called electrolytic mineral accretion. And after we remove the salts and the carbonates, then we can try to go after the high value minerals. Now, I know what you're thinking, Dan, you've been drinking Bloody Marys again for breakfast. No, not today. There are universities working on this process, trying to figure out how to mine lithium from seawater. Why? Because last year, the price of lithium carbonate and lithium hydroxide had gone up 8 times what it was pre-pandemic. And they're looking at a benchmark price of $10,000 per ton. And they think they can make money extracting minerals from seawater. Now, what would ADB do to help this? If governments were interested, if the companies that own the desal plants or the utilities that own the desal plants are interested, ADB could help the client countries host technology development platforms and do this stuff. And we get climate-proof water that pays for itself, and we create these other revenue streams, edible salts, carbon credits from the carbonate removal, maybe some money off of building materials. And then we've got a little money to do our commercial R&D on the high-value metal and mineral mining. And here's just a depiction of how this might work in a sequence of events. And if we can perfect this, and I think that there's a lot of R&D going on in this space that we don't know about because people are not publishing academic papers. They're not publishing academic papers because they're working on proprietary technology to figure out how to get these high value metals. When we perfect this sequence, this series of events, and this sequence, the edible salts, carbonates, other products, this is in a way analogous to fractional distillation of crude oil into various products, gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, et cetera, right? So we can have this new business model applied, retrofit existing desal plants. We don't need to go build and do this on new plants. We go and retrofit and we figure out how to make money on this. And if we can get to that third step where we're getting the high value minerals and metals out of the ground, which we need for the energy transition, for the renewables part, then we don't have to dig holes in the ground anymore, like out there in West Papua, like Freeport, to get that metal out of the ground. And just, to put put some punctuation on this, if we're going to get to net zero, coal, oil, and natural gas have to be left in the ground, or the equivalent CO2 has to be removed from the atmosphere and oceans and sequestered. Left in the ground means left in the ground. And net zero emissions is not enough. We need net zero impact. Why do we need net zero impact? Because there's something called the sixth great extinction going on. And if we look through the climate change lens, we don't see it. If we look through the biodiversity lens, we do see it. And the sixth great extinction includes Homo sapiens. So I'm going to say it once more, net zero emissions is not enough. We need net zero impact. And we can get there, but we need to create virtuous cycles to get there. So thanks very much. Thanks again, Dina.
Many thanks, Dan, for your excellent keynote speech. Actually, you saved us because in the call for papers for this topic, we included extractive industries. Actually, one of the motivation for this was just transition and how people from other sectors will be affected by energy transition, especially low-income groups. So we included extractive industries, but so we didn't get any papers on extractive industries. Yeah. So I think maybe researchers also turned their attention from fossil, maybe from extractive industries more towards clean energy because the research grants more available. Yeah, I also heard many times that getting funding for fossil fuels, it's a lot harder, right? Because many multinational organizations like ADB, World Bank, they have now target for climate finance. Like ADB has a 100 billion climate finance target, right? And but you still showed some project, right? And you mentioned ADB. So I actually learned from you new terminology, re-employment and biocoal. So could you please explain us, what does it mean? You mentioned extractive industries could be repurposed and reemployment. I know repurpose, I understand, but reemployment, what is the difference? And also biocoal, yeah, would you please explain? Thank you.
Sure, thanks. Well, repurposing, one of the easiest examples to think about is taking an open pit from a mining operation or a limestone quarry or other rock quarry. And if you look in the pit and you see water collecting, that's a good sign because you can build a pumped hydro storage plant in that mine pit. And there are some examples of commercial development in Australia where there's a place called the Kidston Mine. The mine stopped operating some years ago, and there's a private developer that's got a concession to take over the old operating area and build 200, 300 megawatts of solar and build a pumped hydro plant in the abandoned mine pit and use that pumped hydro to time shift the solar output. So that's repurposing the mine. You know, otherwise that hole in the ground is just going to sit there. But in that particular site, it's out, you know, in Australia. There aren't a lot of people there. Now, people that used to work in the mining operation can be retrained to work on the pumped hydro plant and on the solar plant. So, you know, these may be blue collar workers, but just because they don't have a PhD doesn't mean that they're stupid, right? There's skilled labor working at the mine. And in my experience, you know, used to work in the upstream oil and gas business. The people that work on oil and gas rigs and in the supply chain that supports them, they're generally pretty good at learning new stuff if they have the chance, if they have to, and if they have a chance. In some parts of the world, like in the U.S., with an abandoned surface mine, you have to do some kind of ecological environmental restoration. So normally that's some kind of a reforestation or revegetation at a minimum. So one of the ideas is to grow biochar or biocoal. So this is the technical process is similar to making charcoal or to making coke from coal for iron production. So now there's a company here in the Philippines that owns 3 or 4 big coal-fired power plants, and they're doing their own R&D project right now to grow biomass and convert it to biochar. And they're doing this on their own. There's no regulatory driver. There's no soft money. The president of the company started doing this sometime last year. And why? I'm pretty sure the reason he's doing it is because he thinks they will be able to make money in the biocoal business in the future. Now they're not, so they're two different products. Biochar is like charcoal. So with biochar, the idea is to make it and bury it in the soil so that it helps restore soil fertility and soil health. And it sequesters the carbon. So we're growing carbon, you know, we're growing biomass, we're taking CO2, moving CO2 from the atmosphere to the plant material. It stays in the charcoal, in the biochar, and then it goes in the ground where it stays for hundreds or thousands of years. So we can claim a carbon credit for that. And, you know, maybe their game plan at this particular company, maybe their game plan is that they're just going to claim a carbon credit for that. But there's another tech to make biocoal. The process is a bit more elaborate because we do something that's similar to a high temperature pyrolysis, and we end up with a product that has mechanical and thermal characteristics that's almost identical to fossil coal. Now that is a bit more difficult to make, and the latest research with numbers that I'd found on that goes back to around 2017 in the US. The cost of production for that biocoal from woody biomass from managed forests, the cost of production was $200 to $250 a ton. So last year when coal was trading at $400 a ton, we could have been making a healthy profit off that. Last week, coal was trading at $220 a ton. Maybe we could break even. Now, in the long run, maybe we can figure out a way to make that biocoal and make it for a lot less than that. But the target on that long-term prices, thermal coal ranges $50 to $100 a ton. So if we could get down to that $75 a ton range with biocoal, we could blend it with fossil coal in an existing power plant to reduce the emissions. We don't have to touch the power plant. So that's the repurposing part. And in the employment creation aspect is that if we're doing this biomass production on an operating coal mine within the contract area, it's an additional effort on the part of the mine operator. So we need people to work on that. And that's people that are not going to be busy working on the coal mining operation or the other mining operation. It's new jobs that are created for that biomass. And I would also emphasize again that we're not only talking about bioenergy crops. What else can we make? We're limited by our imagination more than anything else.
Thank you, Dan. By the way, would you mind to put camera on? You're looking great, so it would be nice to see you. Yeah, if you don't mind. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Everyone says I look good for 70, 75.
Thanks for, I learned a lot from you, and I really like you educated us that's important repurposing, also reemployment. This is especially important for countries who rely on extractive, like a lot of people employed in extractive industries, lots of income coming from extractive industries. In my country, we have whole towns just based on the extractive industry. So countries like Indonesia, Kazakhstan, from developing Asia, I think this is very, very important for them to think not only repurposing, but also reemployment, what will happen to people. So this is very, I think, we will ensure just transition. We have 2 more questions quickly, I think, Dan. We don't have much time. Okay. You can read it in the Q&A, but I'll read for you too. Dan, would you agree the financial motivation for governments, the utilities or industries to move from coal to renewable energy as an energy source is not quite compelling at this point? And second question, also from Anonymous, the speaker mentioned net zero impact and creating vicious cycle. I would like to have the speaker's opinion on the concept of well-being economy, where the citizens' well-being drives economic prosperity, stability, and resilience.
Okay, thanks. On the first question, I think if we look at the U.S. for moving from coal to renewable energy, I think the motivation is there. The federal government makes some money off of coal mining on federal lands, but the thermal coal industry in the United States is a dinosaur. Just as a quick example, in Wyoming, there's one county that has a few mines that accounted for 20% of thermal coal production in the US for most of the last 20 years. The gross revenue from the mining industry, coal mining, thermal coal in the state of Wyoming in the last 10 years has declined from $500 billion a year to $250 billion a year. Now that can be replaced with renewables, and the wind and the solar resources are there in Wyoming, and the potential for innovative biomass production is also there. Now, what the government of the United States is doing in the Inflation Reduction Act last year, there are new incentives for renewables, because coal is dying its own death in the United States. Coal-fired power is dead. It's just that we're seeing it plant by plant being taken out. So what's the replacement, where the national government is providing some incentives, is for the green hydrogen program. And the message has been given. Energy Secretary Granholm and climate czar John Kerry started telling the oil industry a couple of years ago, adapt or die. And that was code for, we're pushing to give you incentives for green hydrogen. And it took a while to get the law passed, but the law passed last year has incentives for green hydrogen. On that second question, this is great. The reason we have the Clean Air Act in the United States is for public health reasons. It's not for climate change, but we're getting a climate change benefit by phasing out of coal because of that. And if we look at biodiversity and public health as central organizing principles to create, that's how we can create virtuous cycles. ADB has some very interesting experience in the People's Republic of China with a regional air quality management program that began around 2015, I think, has done a series of loans totaling about $2.5 billion, I think. And it's about citizens' well-being. People in China don't like the air pollution, right? And the government knew this, the leaders knew this for a long time, but until Xi Jinping came in, none of the previous leaders really took it seriously. And he saw that it was a real existential threat to the party's legitimacy. So if we focus on fundamental pollution control, air quality, water quality, food safety, if you will, and the public health benefits that accrue from that, then we get a much better outcome. To try to put a number on that, back in 2010, again in the US, the National Institutes of Health did a study on the fossil fuel use in the electric power business, and their conclusion was that the non-climate impacts of fossil fuel use in the electric power industry had the equivalent cost of 3.5 cents per kilowatt hour of electricity produced. Now that's not monetized, but if we look at the public health benefits that accrue from phasing out combustion of fossil fuels, especially tailpipe emissions from vehicles in cities, then we get this, that's where we can start creating that virtuous cycle. And I like this concept. The well-being economy is a good organizing concept. Thanks.
Great, Dan, thank you so much. I wish we could continue talking. I actually missed this very interesting question from Arnaud. Would you mind, Dan, we finish this session and you type answer in the Q&A box? Would be this okay for you? Yeah, okay, great.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, everyone. Dan, and the previous session speakers for excellent morning, very informative. Dan, you really saved me. As I said, we didn't have like much on extractive industry, so you making this event very complete with covering this taking care of extractive industries. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Yeah, please, audience and speakers who are available, please join us afternoon in around 2 hours and a half. Please join us again. Thank you very much.